And I'm just so honored to be here at 1882 Institute. Thank you, Ted Gong, and everybody affiliated with 1882. It's so important to be having these conversations and to make sure that our stories are visible and part of the narrative of this country. And I'm just so thrilled to see so many of you out here on this afternoon. I thought it was going to be spring again, like yesterday. Winter's back, but even so, I see a number of people here who are part of the making of this book. And I don't think I can acknowledge everybody, but I would like to say that Kwok family is here, and some of their story, Daphne Kwok, her father and mother, and aunties and uncles who I've been meeting. Scott Seligman, another author here, who has helped me out tremendously. Marcia Mao and the Mao Family Archives. And I think there's a whole crew from the Smithsonian who are keeping the stories of Asian Americans part of the American narrative. And if I went around, I could spend the whole afternoon just thanking and acknowledging every one of you. So I'm just so grateful that you're here. And so my book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, launched, it went on the, started being sold on January 22nd, so about 3 weeks ago. And it's already in its 4th printing. And may I also say, as an Asian American who also, of course, I have that critical side where all the ancestors are criticized, pointing out that even though it's in its 4th printing, it means that it was a little underestimated. Right? And truly, and that's why 1882 and gatherings in our community are so important, because just like Crazy Rich Asians, like, oh, they go to movies, and now it's like they read books and speak English, and I'm sorry, but we know that this is something that is still a question to many people. And so it's very exciting. This book, The Last Boat Out of Shanghai, I spent 12 years on. And so for me, it was a very long gestation process. And, it's finally hatched, and you never know how a book will be received once you spend this time on it. I didn't have any idea that it was going to take 12 years, of course, when I started it. And I should have known better, because it really is the story of modern China, and the story of how China emerged, how and it came to be, to have a communist revolution there, and to talk about the different dynamics of people and the diversity of people within Shanghai, within China. And in spite of the view that all Chinese are the same, or this government in China walks in lockstep altogether, anyone who's been to China knows that actually there is a great divergence and variety of opinions, political views. They might not all be able to be loud about their divergent views, but they're there. And so that was true in the 1930s and the 1940s and 1950s, which are the periods that I cover in this book. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Shanghai? Quite a lot. All right. And so you might have seen some of the slides that we were running through earlier, which were just scenes of old Shanghai from the period of the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s. And so those of you who have been there, you know. Shanghai has been known as the Paris of the Orient. It's not just today. Well, now it might be the burgeoning, new city of the 21st century. But in the 1940s, 1930s, really, it was known as the Paris of the Orient. What did that mean? Well, in the world, there were only a few world-class cities, and Shanghai was one of them. It ranked with New York, London, Paris, Berlin, and Shanghai. And if you were a world-class... Unfortunately, back then, and perhaps as now, it's famous for many things, but so the intellectuals of the world would travel around to go to these different cities and just have these global exchanges. Shanghai was one of the stops. Albert Einstein had been there, George Bernard Shaw, W.H. Auden, Eugene O'Neill, Charlie Chaplin, and you could have a long list of the top intellectuals of the world, and Shanghai was a place that they also had to stop, just to have a sense of what were these global conversations that were happening at that time. Now, I just want to say a few words about how, why this title, Last Boat Out of Shanghai. And so let me ask, how many of you have family members who have said they were on the last boat out of Shanghai? Or the last plane? Or the last train out of Shanghai? So a few. Everywhere I go with these book talks, there's always some people who say our families were on the last boat. And so when I was a kid growing up, that was about the only thing I knew about my family. I'm one of those juk sings who went to China too. So I'm an ABC, and I grew up not knowing, even though people would say, go back where you came from. Well, for me, that was New Jersey. And I don't live there now, and I don't want to go back. So visiting is fine. But I would ask my parents, what about China? What is that place like? And I would, and all I would hear from the time that I was a kid, my mother and my aunt had been on the last boat out of Shanghai. And it would be said with that kind of, very serious, hushed tone, the last boat. And ... and the ... was before the communists came. And as I got older, I was like, well, what is it? And I would meet more and more people who would say, their families were on the last boat, and or last plane, last train. And there was, it soon became very clear that there was no boat that could handle all of the people on the last boat. And then if you pursued it a little bit more, they were in different months, different years, different times, and going to different places. So, however, what they all shared was this sense that they were on the last one, and had they not been on the last one, something dire would have happened. So, that was one of the things I knew about it, until, and the other thing that would happen is I would say to my mom, gee, Mom, tell me something about your growing up when you were a kid. And my mother would always say, that was wartime, unhappy memory. And that would be the end of discussion. And so there was a time that in growing up that I just thought, well, okay, there's nothing to say. And so then I want to share, I guess I want to share this one story that was one of the things that spurred me on to start interviewing people. And that was a little passage I'm going to read about one of my characters. And so I call them characters because I have stories of 4 main people that I tell the story of what happened, starting with the Sino-Japanese War and the first major battle, which was the Battle of Shanghai, a 3-month battle where Shanghai was pretty much decimated except for the foreign concessions. And I start with the Sino-Japanese War, even though we're talking about an exodus that happened in 1949, because it really is the story of modern China, and you can't talk about what happened in 1949 and the victory of the communists over the nationalists without laying the foundation of why that happened. And so that is a whole history. And quite honestly, if I had been allowed to by my publisher, I would have started this in 1911 or 1912, because really we're talking about the founding of the Republic of China, the hope for it, and the disappointment in its collapse. So by starting with the invasion by Japan, we're talking about a time when China was already in deep crisis because of the Opium Wars, because of the extraction of the wealth and the resources out of China to be replaced by opium to sap the strength of the people. And Shanghai was the leading light of China. It was the most advanced, the most technological, the most industrialized, the most international, the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan city in China. It was where some of the wealthiest people of China lived, and it was a city of 6 million. New York at that time was about 7 million maybe, and so it was really comparable to New York in population. And one of the things I did when I was beginning to research this was like, how big was this diaspora? What potentially was it in size? And I talked to one of the top demographers of the city of Shanghai, and he said, of the 6 million, there were maybe 5% of the population was what you would call wealthy, quite wealthy. And about 20% of the population was middle class. You know, tradespeople, professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, and so 20%, pretty sizable. So we're talking about 20 to 25% who, as the revolution approached, had reasons to be concerned. And so that was my gauge of how large this exodus potentially was. And I describe it as people who were from Shanghai or passed through Shanghai to leave. So this particular section I'm going to read comes from 1936. A little girl whose name was only Mei, little sister, and she was with her father about to go on a special trip. He was her baba, and they lived in Changzhou, which is at that time sort of a suburban, not even an ex-urban city, maybe about 100 miles beyond, in the direction of Suzhou, except beyond Suzhou, kind of next to Suzhou. And it was called Changzhou, and this little girl and her father were going on a special trip. So Baba announced that he would take little sister on a train ride to Suzhou, 60 miles toward Shanghai. She remembered every moment of that journey, for she had been giddy that Baba had chosen her, not one of her brothers. She sat on her father's lap, her eyes glued to the window, mesmerized by the neat rice fields and towns just like hers sweeping by in a blur. When they approached Suzhou, she saw men and women dressed in fine silk fabrics and even foreign outfits, unlike her mother's and father's, who wore roughly woven traditional dress. Big posters showed pretty ladies with curly black hair, wearing tight qipao, promoting cigarettes, mosquito coils, and rat poison. When they left the train station, Baba flagged down the driver of a wooden moon-wheeled cart. After a twisty, bumpy ride over arched stone bridges and canals lined by weeping willows, they finally came to a stop at a small store. Inside, her father spoke to the shopkeepers in a low voice, while she stood waiting by the door, looking out at a parade of vendors and hawkers on the street. Soon Baba called for her and told her to stand still beside him. The shopkeepers looked into her mouth and squeezed her thin arms. When they were finished poking and prodding her, one of them took her hand and led her toward another room. As she turned to look for her father, she saw his back as he headed toward the door. "Baba, Baba," she had shouted after him. He didn't turn around. "Baba, come back," she cried. How could he leave without her? The stranger gently pushed her into a small, dark storeroom and locked the door. Alone and terrified of what might lurk in the darkness, at first she could only whimper. Then she steeled herself and called for her father as hard as she could, until she grew hoarse and couldn't shout anymore. Exhausted, she sobbed herself to sleep. When the little girl awakened on the musty dirt floor, she thought she had had a terrible nightmare. But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. She could see the glare of daylight around the cracks. Once again, she screamed for her father. Baba never came. Now, so I heard this story when I was in my 50s. I had already been thinking about, what is this last boat thing? Why did everybody think that they were going to be on the last boat. And I heard this story, and it was told to me by my mother. And it was a secret she had held for more than 70 years. I had never heard this story before. I had always said, you know, Mom, you know, tell me something of your childhood, and I told you what her answer was, bad memory. And one day we were having dinner, and I said, gee, Mom, too bad you can't tell me anything about your growing up. And this time she said, all right, you want to know? I'll tell you. And any child, no matter what age, you stop. And I suddenly heard there was this, a story that began with this. And of course I was just shocked. I hadn't had any idea. At some point I asked my mother, you didn't tell anybody? She said, I couldn't tell anybody. It was, you know, such a shameful secret, you know, and the idea of having been abandoned. And so this was the beginning of a story of her life that began when she was 6 years old. And at some point I said, Mom, the first thing I said to her was, Mom, your memory is so good. And what did I say? And my mother said, I was 6 years old. I remember everything. It was the worst day of